understanding Mercury in the first house would be rather easy and natural and fluid if we just brush up first on what the first house represents and what Mercury represents. So here's the first house. It's the area of the sky associated with the eastern horizon. The eastern horizon is where the sun rises, and the sunrise is the basis for everything that the first house represents. The sunrise is the beginning of the day, and the sunrise brings things to visibility. So, because it's the beginning of the day, the sunrise represents the beginning of the life, the birth, the thing which is produced by the birth, the body, and the person that inhabits and occupies and uses the body, the self. Because sunrise brings things to visibility, the first house represents manifestation, bringing things to visibility, making things tangible things, visible things. And therefore it also represents your traits, tangible, visible, manifest things about yourself, your appearance, your character, your skills, your strengths, your weaknesses, and so forth. So that wasn't too hard. Let's do a similar brush up on what Mercury represents. Mercury basically symbolizes intelligence. And intelligence does two things. It deals with codes and patterns. Because intellect deals with codes, Mercury signifies communication. Communication is the act of encoding an idea in some format that can be expressed or shared with other people. And communication also has to do with decoding the information that has been shared with you. Communication is basically saying interaction, so Mercury symbolizes interaction. And also this includes interactions like exchanging things, not just ideas, but exchanging things. So Mercury impacts trade as well. Interaction is done amongst people with whom you're related, so Mercury represents relationships, especially friendships or peers, people with whom you just freely exchange things in both directions. It's not a one-way exchange from a superior to an inferior. And being friendly, Mercury therefore is kind of fun, so it represents recreation. Mercury is witty, Mercury tells good jokes, Mercury is funny, Mercury is fun, Mercury is youthful, Mercury is friendly. Now, in order to put things into codes and decode things that are coded, one has to recognize patterns. So intellect has all to do with recognition of patterns, and therefore Mercury represents learning, because learning means figuring out how to interpret a pattern. Mercury also represents organization, because organization means efficiency and how you deal with patterns and the ability to put things into good patterns. So Mercury, therefore, is also very neat. Neatness is another aspect of organized. If you're very organized and efficient, then your patterns have symmetry. And so Mercury represents symmetry, patterns matching other patterns, which affects our beauty and our appearance and also affects our balance. Physical balance as well as emotional balance, mental balance, intellectual balance. Because of having to do with balance, Mercury therefore represents dexterity, which is again not just physical dexterity, but also intellectual dexterity or expertise. Now that we've brushed up on what Mercury symbolizes and what the first house symbolizes, as I promised, it should be pretty natural or fluid or easy to interpret what Mercury means when it's in the first house. All that we need to do is put the two symbolic trees side by side and see what links between them. For example, Mercury has to do with beauty and the first house has to do with appearance. So because this is a link between the planet and the house it occupies, it's something very important to interpret to understand the planet and the house. Mercury is the planet of expertise, and the first is the house of skills. So that's another seed that will grow into an interpretation of Mercury in the first house. And the third is that Mercury is the planet of relationships, but the first house is self. So once you've identified the links between the planet and the house, your next task is to figure out what those links mean. If you're good with intuition, it should be almost obvious already, but it's always good to go through the steps anyway, because you discover extra things that you didn't initially think about. So let's do that now. The first seed is that Mercury is the planet of beauty, and the first house is the house of appearance. What does this mean? People with Mercury in the first house, they're very visual. They're appearance oriented. They know how to make a good appearance. They're good looking. They're clean. So for example, many painters, sculptors, designers, models have Mercury in the first house. A few examples are Frida Kahlo, the painter, both the Versace's, Gianni and Donatella, the model Gigi Hadid, and the model Candy Bar. People that are good looking make a living out of looks, or people who create art. Another seed about Mercury in the first house is that Mercury is the planet of expertise, and the first is the house of skills. So what grows from this seed? Well, a person with Mercury in the first house is probably sophisticated. They have expertise, they're skillful, they're refined, they're talented. So many writers, many poets, many musicians have Mercury in the first house. T.S. Eliot, George Lucas, Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, Andrea Bocelli, to name a very few. And the third seed of Mercury in the first house is that Mercury is the planet of relationships, and the first house is the house of the self. So they're connecting, but not necessarily in the most easy way. So how do you interpret this? How do you grow this seed into an interpretation? People with Mercury in the first house, they have an adjustable self. So that can be very good if you can get into acting, but it can also be very good if you can get into negotiations, diplomacy, and cooperation. Things that require cooperation or facilitating cooperation. It can also be a little bit difficult if you're looking for a clearly defined anchor sense of who you definitely are. So many actors have Mercury in the first house. Many actors and actresses. For example, Goldie Hawn, Paul Newman, Danny DeVito, Matt Dillon, Tom Selleck, and Leonardo DiCaprio. So these are the basic ways that the seeds grow into interpretations for Mercury in the first house. But just as the same seed would grow differently in different soil, similarly the same placement like Mercury in the first house actually works differently in different signs and in different conjunctions and aspects in different charts. These people that we mentioned in this video as exemplary of Mercury in the first house, they are who they are, not just because they have Mercury in the first house, but because of how their whole chart synergizes with Mercury in the first house. If you want to understand the whole context of your chart, the soil in which your interpretive seeds grow, then visit my website, vicdicara.com, and click Readings. My complete chart report explains each and every nook and cranny of your chart and will keep you occupied in self-discovery for years. I also have 2 groundbreaking new reports. The first of these, Your Nakshatra, organizes your active nakshatras in order of their importance to you and presents the fundamental interpretations for the planets that occupy them. And the newest report, Star Strength, uses a system called Tarahabala to unfold 90 interpretations of the nuanced relationships between all the planets in your chart, which paints a rich and detailed picture of how your various strengths cooperate or compete with each other. Order these or any of my reports and accelerate your journey to deeper self-understanding.